The altimeter read 25,000 feet when Oberleutnant Franz Stigler first saw them. Two dark shapes against the morning sky over the Rhineland. March 19, 1943. Twin boom aircraft, unmistakable silhouettes. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio headset. Amerikanische Maschinen, 2 o'clock high. Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, throttle forward, supercharger whining as the fighter clawed for altitude. Behind him, 3 more aircraft from his staffel followed. The Americans were perhaps 2,000 feet above them, heading east. Bomber escort duty, Stigler assumed. Twin-engine aircraft always meant one thing: heavy, stable gun platforms or reconnaissance machines. Easy prey if you caught them without their charges. He had shot down 17 Allied aircraft by this point in the war. He knew how engagements developed, understood the limitations of different aircraft types. Twin-engine fighters were a contradiction in terms, an American experiment that violated basic principles of aerial combat. Every pilot in the Luftwaffe knew this. Fighters needed to be light, agile, fast in the turn. Adding a second engine meant adding weight, drag, complexity. It meant sacrificing the very qualities that kept you alive in a dogfight. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans held their course. That was the first unusual thing. Most twin-engine aircraft, when they spotted enemy fighters climbing toward them, either dove for cloud cover or turned for home. These two continued straight and level, as if they owned the sky at this altitude. Stigler's engine was laboring now, 23,000 feet. The air was thin here, cold enough that frost formed on the inside of his canopy despite the heating system. His Bf 109, the Gustav model with the improved supercharger, could reach this altitude, but it took time, and the engine protested. At 24,000 feet, his rate of climb had dropped to barely 200 feet per minute. The Americans were still 1,000 feet above him. They should have been struggling even more. Twin engines or not, that much airframe and that much weight should have made high-altitude flight nearly impossible. Yet, they maintained altitude effortlessly, and now, as Stigler watched through his gun sight, they began to turn, not away, toward him. The lead aircraft banked, revealing its full profile. The twin booms, the central nacelle, the distinctive silhouette he had seen in intelligence briefings. Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The Americans called it the fork-tailed devil. German intelligence had documented its appearance in North Africa, then in the Mediterranean. Reports said it was fast at altitude, heavily armed. But reports also said many things. Stigler had learned to trust his own experience more than briefing documents written by men who had never been in a cockpit. The P-38 completed its turn and dove. Not a panicked escape dive, but a controlled, aggressive attack run. The second aircraft followed, both now accelerating down toward the climbing Messerschmitts. Stigler's instinct, honed through 2 years of combat, told him to brake. But his training, the doctrine that had been hammered into him since flight school, said twin-engine aircraft could not dogfight. They were too heavy, too sluggish. If you could force them into a turning engagement, they were finished. The extra weight of that second engine made them helpless against a proper single-engine fighter. He held his course. His wingman held formation. The Americans kept coming, and in the seconds before the engagement began, before tracers started cutting through the cold air at 25,000 feet, Franz Stigler believed absolutely that he understood how this fight would end. He was wrong. To understand what Franz Stigler believed that morning, you must understand what every fighter pilot in 1943 knew about aerial combat. The principles were not theoretical. They were written in the wreckage of aircraft across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. They were proven by thousands of engagements, documented in after-action reports, taught in every fighter school from England to Germany to Japan. Weight was the enemy of maneuverability. A fighter aircraft existed to kill other aircraft through superior positioning and firepower. To achieve superior positioning, you needed to turn inside your opponent's turn, to climb faster, to accelerate more quickly. Every pound of additional weight reduced these capabilities. Every square foot of additional drag made you slower. The mathematical relationship was unforgiving and absolute. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the primary fighter of the Luftwaffe, embodied this philosophy perfectly. The early models, the Emil, variants that had fought in the Battle of Britain, weighed just under 5,000 pounds empty. The later Gustav models, with improved engines and additional equipment, had grown to 6,500 pounds. German engineers worried constantly about this weight increase. They knew that every additional pound meant a slightly wider turn radius, a slightly longer time to altitude, a slightly reduced rate of roll. The 109's primary opponent in the early war, the British Supermarine Spitfire, weighed roughly the same. The two aircraft could meet as equals because they shared similar design philosophies: single engine, compact airframe, minimal weight, maximum agility. Dogfights between 109s and Spitfires came down to pilot skill, positioning, and luck. The aircraft themselves were closely matched because both nations understood the fundamental equation of fighter design. The Focke-Wulf FV 190, which entered service in 1941, was heavier at nearly 7,000 pounds empty. German pilots initially worried about this, but the 190 compensated for its weight with a massive BMW radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower. The extra power maintained performance despite the extra weight. More importantly, the 190 proved that weight increases only worked if you added proportional power. The engine-to-weight ratio remained the critical factor. Twin-engine fighters violated this principle completely. Adding a second engine meant adding a second engine's weight, a second propeller, a second set of fuel systems, additional cooling systems, a longer fuselage or unconventional airframe to mount both engines. The weight penalty was enormous. Even if you gained the power of two engines, you gained far more than twice the weight of one. The Germans had tried twin-engine fighters themselves. The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10, introduced before the war, was designed as a heavy fighter and destroyer. It weighed 12,000 pounds empty, more than twice the weight of a 109. It had two engines producing over 2,000 combined horsepower. On paper, it should have been formidable. In combat over Britain in 1940, the 1-10 was slaughtered. British Hurricanes and Spitfires, weighing half as much, turned inside the heavy fighters effortlessly. The 110s could not dogfight. They could not escape by turning. Their only defense was speed in a straight line or diving. The Luftwaffe lost so many 110s so quickly that they withdrew them from daylight operations within months. The lesson was clear and written in the blood of dead crews. Twin-engine aircraft could not fight single-engine fighters in air-to-air combat. They were bombers, reconnaissance platforms, night fighters where speed and firepower mattered more than agility. They were not day fighters. They could not be day fighters. Physics forbade it. This understanding was not limited to the Germans. The British learned similar lessons with their twin-engine Bristol Beaufighter, which found its role as a night fighter and anti-shipping aircraft rather than a day fighter. The Japanese twin-engine fighters, like the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, operated exclusively at night. Every air force that attempted to build twin-engine day fighters discovered the same truth. The weight penalty was insurmountable. Then the Americans arrived with their Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and they appeared to have ignored every lesson learned in the previous 3 years of air combat. The aircraft had not one but two Allison V-1710 engines. It had two turbochargers, two cooling systems, two propellers. It had a central nacelle containing the cockpit and armament, connected to twin booms that held the engines and tail surfaces. The entire configuration was unconventional, even bizarre by European standards. German intelligence officers examining early reconnaissance photographs thought it might be a bomber variant, or perhaps an attack aircraft designed for ground support. The idea that it was a pure fighter, intended to engage other fighters in air-to-air combat, seemed implausible. The aircraft weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, similar to the failed Bf 1-10. Loaded with fuel and ammunition, it exceeded 17,000 pounds. That was nearly 3 times the weight of a Bf 109. The engines produced just over 3,000 combined horsepower, giving the P-38 a reasonable power-to-weight ratio. But reasonable was not excellent. The 109, with its later model Daimler-Benz engines, had a power-to-weight ratio that was actually superior on paper. More importantly, the P-38's configuration meant enormous drag. Twin booms created turbulence, the central nacelle disrupted airflow, the overall frontal area was massive compared to a sleek single-engine fighter. When the first P-38s appeared over North Africa in November 1942, Luftwaffe pilots approached them with confidence. Here was another heavy fighter, another twin-engine experiment that would fail as all the others had failed. The engagements would prove the superiority of proper single-engine fighter design. The first combat reports were confusing. Some P-38s were shot down, confirming expectations, but others escaped, and they escaped not by running away, but by outclimbing their pursuers. Pilots reported that the American aircraft could maintain altitude where Messerschmitts and Macchi fighters began to struggle. This was attributed to pilot error or misidentification. Twin-engine aircraft, everyone knew, could not outclimb single-engine fighters. More reports arrived through December and January, P-38s operating over Tunisia, P-38s escorting bombers, P-38s engaging in combat at altitudes above 20,000 feet. The pattern was consistent enough that it could not be dismissed. The aircraft was performing far better at high altitude than it should have. The explanation, German intelligence analysts decided, was that the Americans were simply avoiding turning combat. They were using superior numbers and hit-and-run tactics, diving from altitude and escaping before German fighters could force them into a dogfight. This made tactical sense. If you knew your aircraft could not turn with the enemy, you avoided turning. You used your advantages, whatever they were, and refused combat on the enemy's terms. What German analysts did not yet understand was the revolution hidden inside those twin booms. Each Allison engine was equipped with a General Electric turbocharger, a sophisticated piece of engineering that used exhaust gases to compress incoming air before it entered the engine. At sea level, this made little difference, but as altitude increased and air density decreased, the turbochargers maintained engine power where conventional supercharged engines began to fade. A Bf 109 Gustav, with its mechanically driven supercharger, produced 1,350 horsepower at sea level. By 20,000 feet, that had dropped to perhaps 900 horsepower. By 25,000 feet, barely 700. The engine was starving for air, the supercharger unable to compress enough oxygen to maintain combustion efficiency. The P-38's Allison engines, with their turbochargers, produced 1,150 horsepower each at sea level. At 20,000 feet, they still produced over 1,000 horsepower each. At 25,000 feet, they maintained better than 90% of their rated power. The Americans had not violated the laws of physics. They had simply solved a different problem. They had built an aircraft that owned the sky above 20,000 feet, where thin air defeated conventional fighters. German pilots, climbing to intercept American bomber formations, discovered this in the most direct way possible. They struggled. For altitude, engines laboring, climb rates dropping, while P-38 circled above them seemingly without effort. When they finally reached bombing altitude, exhausted from the climb, the American fighters dove on them with speed and energy to spare. Franz Stigler had logged over 400 combat hours by March 1943. He knew his Bf 109 intimately, understood its capabilities and limitations, as well as he understood his own body. He knew that above 22,000 feet, the engine began to lose power noticeably. The supercharger, driven mechanically from the crankshaft, could only compress the thin air so much. Higher altitude meant less oxygen for combustion, less power from each firing stroke, less thrust from the propeller. The 109 Gustav 6 model he flew that day was among the best high-altitude variants Germany produced. The Daimler-Benz 605 engine had a sophisticated two-stage supercharger system with a low-altitude and high-altitude mode. Below 15,000 feet, the first stage provided adequate boost. Above that, the second stage engaged, providing additional compression. This system allowed the 109 to reach altitudes approaching 38,000 feet in optimal conditions. But reaching an altitude and fighting at that altitude were entirely different matters. At 25,000 feet, Stigler's engine was producing perhaps 800 of its rated 1,350 horsepower. His rate of climb had dropped to barely 150 feet per minute. His controls felt sluggish in the thin air. The ailerons required more force to move, the elevator was less responsive, the rudder less effective. Every maneuver took longer to execute, every turn required more space to complete. This was normal. This was how high-altitude flight felt in a single-engine fighter. You accepted the reduced performance as the price of altitude. You planned your attacks accordingly, diving from above to build speed, making your firing pass, then using your momentum to climb back up. You did not attempt to dogfight at this altitude because the aircraft simply could not maneuver effectively. The air was too thin, the engine too starved for oxygen, the controls too unresponsive. The P-38 diving toward him showed none of these limitations. It maintained speed in the dive, tracers from its nose-mounted guns reaching out toward Stigler's formation. He broke right, pulling the stick back and to the side, trying to turn inside the American's attack. His 109 responded sluggishly, the turn taking precious seconds to develop. The P-38 flashed past, its speed in the dive far greater than Stigler had expected from such a heavy aircraft. Then the American pulled up, not a gentle climb to preserve energy, but a sharp pull, the nose coming up aggressively, the aircraft converting speed into altitude with startling efficiency. Stigler watched it climb away, expecting it to stall, to falter, to show the inevitable weakness of a heavy twin-engine design trying to maneuver at altitude. It did not falter. It climbed at a rate that seemed impossible. Stigler's own climb rate at this altitude was perhaps 150 feet per minute, and that required careful management of airspeed and engine power. The P-38 was climbing at what looked like 500 feet per minute, maybe more, without any apparent strain on its engines or airframe. His wingman had managed to get behind the second P-38 during the initial engagement. The American pilot did what any sensible pilot would do when bounced from behind. He turned, hard, banking steeply to the left, trying to force his attacker into an overshoot, or at least spoil his firing solution. This should have been a fatal mistake. Twin-engine fighters could not turn with single-engine fighters. The extra weight, the extra drag, the basic physics of the situation made it impossible. Stigler's wingman should have been able to turn inside the American, maintain his position, line up his shot. Instead, the P-38 completed its turn in what appeared to be nearly the same radius as the 109. Perhaps the turn was slightly wider, perhaps the American had given up a bit of altitude in the turn, but the difference was marginal. Certainly not the massive advantage a 109 should have held over an aircraft weighing 3 times as much. Stigler's wingman lost his firing solution. The P-38, completing its turn, had somehow maintained enough energy to reverse direction and dive away before the German pilot could reposition. Both American aircraft were now below the Messerschmitts, building speed in their dive, then pulling up into another climb that carried them back up to altitude with what seemed like effortless ease. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes. In that time, Stigler fired one brief burst that missed completely. His wingman fired 2 bursts with similar results, and the other members of his staffel never managed to bring their guns to bear. The Americans broke off the engagement when they wanted to, climbing away to the west, and there was nothing the German pilots could do to prevent it. They could not catch the P-38s in a climb, could not turn with them effectively, could not force them into the kind of close-range turning fight where German experience and training should have prevailed. After landing, Stigler filed his combat report with unusual care. He described the engagement in detail, noted the P-38's performance characteristics, specifically mentioned its climb rate and turning ability at altitude. His squadron commander read the report, then called him into his office. "You're certain about these observations?" the commander asked. Stigler was certain. He had seen it with his own eyes. What Franz Stigler could not know, standing in his squadron commander's office trying to explain what he had witnessed, was that American engineers had spent 3 years solving a problem German engineers did not even recognize existed. The problem was not how to build a fighter that could turn with a Messerschmitt at 10,000 feet. It was how to build a fighter that could dominate the airspace above 20,000 feet where modern bomber formations operated and where the air war was increasingly being fought. The Allison V1710 engine was not particularly remarkable at sea level. It produced 1150 horsepower, respectable but not exceptional. The Daimler-Benz 605 in Stigler's 109 produced more power. The BMW Radial in the Focke-Wulf 190 produced significantly more. At low altitude, the P-38 had no particular advantage. It was heavier, draggier, and in a turning fight below 15,000 feet, a competent pilot in a 109 or 190 could usually defeat it. But Allison and General Electric had focused their development effort on high-altitude performance. The turbocharger system, mounted in the tail section of each boom, used exhaust gases that would otherwise be wasted to drive a turbine. That turbine compressed incoming air before it entered the engine's own mechanical supercharger. The result was a two-stage compression system that maintained sea-level air density at the engine's intake, even when the aircraft was operating at 25,000 feet or higher. The mathematics were unforgiving and favored the Americans completely. At 25,000 feet, where Stigler's 109 was producing approximately 800 horsepower, each of the P-38's Allison engines was still producing over 1,000 horsepower. The American aircraft had 2,000 total horsepower available at an altitude where the German fighter had 800. The power-to-weight ratio, which favored the 109 at sea level, reversed dramatically at altitude. The 109 at 25,000 feet was effectively trying to maneuver 6,500 pounds of aircraft with 800 horsepower. The P-38 was maneuvering 17,000 pounds with 2,000 horsepower. Proportionally, at this specific altitude, the American aircraft actually had more power per pound than the German fighter. German intelligence had pieces of this information. They knew the P-38 had turbochargers. They had technical drawings obtained from various sources, including crashed aircraft examined in North Africa. They understood, theoretically, that turbochargers improved high-altitude performance. What they had not done, and what Franz Stigler's combat report forced them to confront, was calculate exactly how much of an advantage this technology provided in actual combat conditions. Luftwaffe test pilots flew captured P-38s when they could obtain them in flyable condition. A relatively intact example was recovered in North Africa in early 1943, repaired, and flown at the Rhineland Test Center. The test pilots confirmed what combat pilots were reporting. At high altitude, the aircraft performed far better than its weight, and configuration suggested it should. The turbochargers were not merely an incremental improvement, they were a fundamental change in how high-altitude flight worked. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German response to this revelation was limited by resources and doctrine. They could have attempted to develop their own turbocharger systems. Some engineering work was done in this direction, but Germany's industrial capacity was already stretched thin. Turbochargers required sophisticated metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and extensive development time. They were complex, expensive, and difficult to maintain. German industry was focused on producing existing designs in quantity, not developing revolutionary new engine technologies. Instead, the Luftwaffe adapted tactically. Pilots were instructed to avoid engagement with P-38s above 20,000 feet if possible. If combat was unavoidable, they were to dive away, forcing the American pilots to follow them down to lower altitudes where German fighters had better performance. They were to use superior numbers and coordination to offset the P-38's altitude advantage. They were never to attempt to outclimb a P-38. These were sound tactical adaptations, but they conceded the fundamental point. The Americans owned the sky above 20,000 feet. German fighters could operate there, could survive there, but they could not dominate there. The P-38, with its twin engines and unconventional design and turbocharged power plants, had reversed the equation that governed fighter combat. For Luftwaffe pilots who had spent years believing they understood the fundamental principles of aerial combat, encountering the P-38 at altitude produced a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. Everything they knew said twin-engine fighters were inferior. Everything they experienced said this particular twin-engine fighter was not. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11 over Germany, recorded his first encounter with P-38s in his diary in July 1943. His squadron was climbing to intercept American bombers at 24,000 feet. P-38s appeared above them, diving to attack. Nock's first instinct, based on years of experience, was to turn into the attack and force a turning engagement. The Americans, he assumed, would break off rather than dogfight. They did not break off. They completed their attack, climbed away, and returned for another pass. Nock and his wingman attempted to climb after them. The P-38 simply climbed faster. When Nock tried to force a turning engagement, the Americans turned with him, not quite as tightly as his Bf 109, but close enough that he could not gain a decisive advantage. After 10 minutes of combat, neither side had scored hits, but Nock's fuel state was critical from prolonged combat at full power. The Americans, with their greater fuel capacity, could have continued fighting indefinitely. Nock wrote that evening that he had encountered a fighter that should not exist according to everything we know about aircraft design. The phrase appears in multiple German pilot accounts from this period. The P-38 violated their understanding of how fighters worked. It was too heavy to maneuver, yet it maneuvered adequately. It had too much drag to be fast, yet it was fast enough. It should have been helpless at high altitude, yet it dominated there. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots with over 100 victories, encountered P-38s over Italy in late 1943. In post-war interviews, he described the psychological impact of fighting an enemy whose equipment capabilities exceeded what you believed was possible. German pilots had been taught that their training, their experience, and their superior fighter designs would compensate for numerical inferiority. The P-38, particularly at high altitude, challenged all three assumptions. The training that told them twin-engine fighters were inferior was demonstrably wrong in this case. The experience they had gained, fighting Spitfires and Hurricanes, did not translate to fighting an aircraft with fundamentally different performance characteristics. And the 109, which had been the Luftwaffe's primary fighter since 1937, was simply not designed for the kind of high-altitude combat where American daylight bombing operations took place. By late 1943, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had evolved to treat P-38s with the same respect they gave to any competent single-engine fighter. The pretense that they were heavy, sluggish, easy prey had been abandoned. Intelligence documents circulated to fighter units identified the P-38 as a high-altitude superiority fighter and recommended avoiding engagement above 20,000 feet unless German pilots held significant tactical advantages. This represented a complete reversal of the assumptions Luftwaffe pilots had held just 1 year earlier. The aircraft that should have been an easy kill, that violated every principle of fighter design they understood, had proven itself in the most definitive way possible. It had dominated them in their own airspace, protecting American bombers that were systematically destroying German industry. The admission, when it came in official documents and tactical briefings, was couched in technical language about turbocharger advantages and power-to-weight ratios at specific altitudes. But the emotional reality was simpler and more painful. German pilots had believed their understanding of fighter combat was superior. They had believed their doctrine was sound. They had believed twin engines meant weakness. The Americans, with their industrial capacity and their willingness to try unconventional solutions, had proven all of those beliefs wrong, not through propaganda or claims, but through the unarguable evidence of combat. When a P-38 outclimbed your Messerschmitt at 25,000 feet, when it turned inside your firing solution and escaped before you could react, when it shot down your wingman and you could do nothing to prevent it, you could no longer maintain comfortable assumptions about technological superiority. The Luftwaffe's response to the P-38's high-altitude dominance revealed both the flexibility and the limitations of German air doctrine in the latter half of the war. Fighter units developed new tactics specifically for engaging American escort fighters at altitude. But these tactics were fundamentally defensive in nature. They accepted rather than challenged the P-38's advantages. Jagdgeschwader II, based in northern France in late 1943, implemented a tactical doctrine that became standard across fighter units facing American daylight raids. When radar detected incoming bomber formations, fighters would scramble and climb to altitude well before the Americans arrived. This gave German pilots time to reach combat altitude while their engines were still relatively fresh, rather than climbing desperately while P-38s circled above them. Once at altitude, German fighters would position themselves up-sun from the bomber stream if possible, giving them a positional advantage and making them harder to spot. They would wait for any gap in the escort coverage, any moment when P-38s were engaged elsewhere, or when bomber formations flew beyond the range of their escorts. Only then would they attack, diving through the bomber formation, making one firing pass, then diving away to lower altitude before American escorts could intercept. This tactic, called dive and run by German pilots, was effective but limited. It allowed Luftwaffe fighters to shoot down some bombers while minimizing their own losses, but it did not stop the bomber offensive. It did not regain control of German airspace. It was a survival tactic, not a winning strategy. The admission that German fighters could not contest air superiority at the altitudes where American bombers operated was implicit in every tactical briefing. Individual pilots developed their own techniques for dealing with P-38s. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, who commanded Jagdgeschwader II until his death in March 1944, pioneered head-on attacks against bomber formations. This approach had the advantage of closing speed so quickly that escort fighters had minimal time to react. Meyer achieved considerable success with this tactic, but it required exceptional piloting skill and nerves. Most pilots found it too dangerous to execute consistently. Others focused on the P-38's weaknesses rather than trying to match its strengths. The aircraft's twin-boom configuration, while providing excellent high-altitude performance, created some unusual flight characteristics. If one engine was damaged or lost power, the asymmetric thrust made the aircraft difficult to control. Some German pilots specifically targeted P-38 engines with their cannon fire, knowing that knocking out one engine gave them a significant advantage. The P-38 also had compressibility issues in high-speed dives. At speeds above 450 miles per hour in a dive, airflow over the wings could reach transonic speeds, creating shock waves that made the aircraft difficult or impossible to control. Several P-38s were lost when pilots could not pull out of high-speed dives. German pilots learned to exploit this by forcing P-38s into steep dives, though this tactic required giving up altitude advantage and often put the German fighter in danger as well. But these were marginal advantages, tactical opportunities that skilled pilots could sometimes exploit. They did not change the fundamental equation. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a defensive war in its own airspace, outnumbered by escort fighters that included not only P-38s but also P-47s and, from early 1944, P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang, with its Merlin engine and conventional single-engine design, matched or exceeded the P-38's high-altitude performance while being lighter and more maneuverable at all altitudes. The P-38 continued to serve throughout the war, but its role evolved. In the European theatre, it was increasingly relegated to ground attack and reconnaissance missions, while P-51s took over primary escort duties. The Lightning found its greatest success in the Pacific and Mediterranean theatres, where its long range, twin-engine reliability over water, and devastating firepower made it the highest-scoring American fighter platform. Major Richard Bong shot down 40 enemy aircraft flying P-38s in the Pacific. Major Thomas Maguire scored 38 victories in the same aircraft type. For Luftwaffe pilots, the lessons learned fighting P-38s at altitude were not academic exercises. They were visceral, immediate, and sometimes fatal education in how technology could overturn accepted doctrine. Franz Stigler survived the war, flying combat missions until May 1945. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged that the P-38 had been his introduction to a new kind of warfare, where American industrial capacity and willingness to innovate produced weapons systems that challenged everything German doctrine assumed. Behind every P-38 that climbed effortlessly to 25,000 feet and outmaneuvered a Messerschmitt was an industrial system that German military planners had fundamentally misunderstood. Lockheed's Burbank, California facility produced the Lightning on assembly lines that operated with a precision and efficiency that would have seemed impossible to European manufacturers. The production numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Lockheed built 10,097 P-38s between 1941 and 1945. That was approximately 6 aircraft per day at peak production, 7 days a week, for years. Each aircraft required 2 Allison engines, 2 turbochargers, 2 propellers, miles of wiring, thousands of rivets, and hundreds of individual components. The supply chain that delivered these components to Burbank operated with clockwork reliability. General Electric produced the turbochargers at facilities in Massachusetts. Allison manufactured engines in Indianapolis. Curtiss-Wright made propellers in Ohio. Hamilton Standard produced propeller hubs and governors in Connecticut. None of these suppliers were particularly close to the final assembly plant, but American rail networks and logistics systems moved components across thousands of miles without significant delays. Compare this to German fighter production in the same period. Messerschmitt built approximately 33,000 Bf-109s during the entire war, across all variants. This sounds impressive until you realize this production occurred in multiple factories across Germany and occupied territories over a longer time period, using a simpler design with 1 engine instead of 2. The 109 was easier to build, required fewer complex components, and represented mature manufacturing technology. Yet Germany produced them at a rate only marginally higher than the United States produced the far more complex P-38. Focke-Wulf produced approximately 20,000 190s across all variants. Again, single-engine aircraft, less complex than the Lightning, built by a nation whose entire industrial capacity was focused on military production. The combined German single-engine fighter production exceeded American numbers, but Germany was fighting on multiple fronts against opponents who collectively far outproduced them. The quality of American production was as significant as the quantity. P-38s, built in 1944, had refinements and improvements that made them superior to the 1942 models. Lockheed continuously incorporated lessons learned in combat, improving engine reliability, strengthening structural components, upgrading radio equipment, and refining the turbocharger systems. The aircraft got better even as production numbers increased. German fighter production, by contrast, became increasingly desperate. By 1944, factories were dispersed to avoid bombing, using slave labor from concentration camps, operating with chronic shortages of critical materials. Quality control suffered. Aircraft reached operational units with defects that would have been unacceptable earlier in the war. Engines failed prematurely. Radios malfunctioned. Electrical systems were unreliable. The turbocharger technology that gave the P-38 its high-altitude advantage represented an industrial achievement Germany could not replicate even if they had wanted to. General Electric's turbocharger production required high-temperature alloys, precision machining, and sophisticated quality control. The turbines operated at extreme temperatures and rotational speeds. Any manufacturing defect could cause catastrophic failure. Germany had the theoretical knowledge to build turbochargers, but lacked the industrial infrastructure to produce them reliably in quantity. This pattern repeated across military technology. The Norden bomb sight, which American bombers used to improve accuracy, required precision manufacturing that few nations could match. American radar systems became smaller, lighter, and more reliable as the war progressed. American radio equipment was standardized across units, making maintenance and replacement simple. American aircraft had redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor protection that prioritized crew survival. German engineering focused on performance and innovation, but often at the expense of reliability and ease of production. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was technologically advanced but plagued by engine reliability problems. The engines lasted perhaps 10 hours before requiring major overhaul or replacement. American jet engines, developed slightly later, were far more reliable. When the P-80 Shooting Star entered service near the war's end, its engines could operate for 40 hours between overhauls. For Luftwaffe pilots fighting against increasing numbers of American aircraft, the industrial disparity was visible in every engagement. American formations grew larger as the war progressed. The escorts were more numerous, better coordinated, and increasingly aggressive. When a P-38 was shot down, 3 more appeared the next day. When a Luftwaffe pilot was killed, replacing him took months of training time the Reich no longer had. When a Messerschmitt was destroyed, the replacement might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. On the morning of March 19, 1943, Franz Stigler believed he understood fighter combat. Twin engines meant weight. Weight meant sluggishness. Sluggishness meant death in a dogfight. These were not opinions but observed facts, proven in combat from Poland to Britain to North Africa. They were the foundation of Luftwaffe tactical doctrine and German fighter design philosophy. 3 minutes of combat at 25,000 feet shattered that understanding completely. The P-38 that dove toward him, that climbed away effortlessly, that turned inside his wingman's attack, should not have been possible according to everything he knew. But there it was, undeniable and lethal, violating principles that were supposed to be inviolate. This was the pattern that repeated throughout the war for German military forces. The assumptions that had served them well in the opening campaigns, the doctrine that had brought victory in Poland and France and the Balkans, proved inadequate against opponents with greater industrial capacity and willingness to innovate. The Luftwaffe believed fighter combat was about agility and pilot skill. The Americans demonstrated that power and altitude could matter more. The Wehrmacht believed in lightning warfare and decisive maneuver. The Soviets demonstrated that mass and attrition could overcome tactical brilliance. The Kriegsmarine believed submarines could strangle Britain. Allied convoy systems and anti-submarine warfare demonstrated otherwise. In each case, German forces adapted tactically. They developed new techniques, modified their equipment, trained their personnel differently, but tactical adaptation could not overcome strategic disadvantages. You could learn to fight P-38s more effectively, but you could not produce them faster than Lockheed. You could develop tactics to minimize losses, but you could not train replacement pilots as quickly as America graduated them from flight schools. The P-38, with its twin engines and unconventional design and turbocharged dominance of high-altitude airspace, was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of industrial capacity applied to military problems. It was proof that the nation with more factories, more resources, more engineers, and more willingness to try unconventional solutions could overcome the nation with better initial doctrine and more combat experience. Franz Stigler survived the war and eventually emigrated to Canada. In later years, he maintained contact with American pilots he had fought against, including a famous encounter with a damaged B-17 that he chose not to shoot down. When asked about his experiences fighting P-38s, he was characteristically direct. They were better than German intelligence had led him to believe. They were effective where it mattered most, and there were too many of them to stop, even if German pilots had enjoyed tactical parity. The Luftwaffe produced excellent pilots and flew capable aircraft throughout the war. Individual German fighters could and did shoot down P-38s in combat. But by 1944, the question was never whether a skilled German pilot could defeat an American escort fighter. The question was whether German fighters could stop the bomber offensive that was systematically destroying the Reich's ability to wage war. The answer, written across the skies of Germany in contrails and wreckage, was no. The P-38 represented a specific solution to a specific problem. How to protect bomber formations operating at 25,000 feet over hostile territory thousands of miles from home. Lockheed's engineers had focused on range, altitude, and firepower, rather than low-altitude dogfighting ability. They accepted weight penalties and unconventional design in exchange for capabilities that mattered for their intended mission, and they succeeded completely, producing a fighter that dominated precisely where it needed to dominate. For German pilots who encountered them, the lesson was bitter but clear. Your understanding of how things should work means nothing when confronted with evidence that they work differently. Your experience and training and doctrine, however valid they once were, become obsolete when the enemy changes the fundamental parameters of combat. And courage, skill, and determination, while admirable, cannot overcome industrial disadvantages measured in factors of 10 or more. The twin engines that Franz Stigler saw diving toward him that March morning were not a design flaw. They were not evidence of American engineering incompetence or failure to understand fighter combat principles. They were evidence that American engineers had asked different questions and arrived at different answers, and that those answers worked devastatingly well in the environment where the air war was actually being fought. The P-38 climbed effortlessly to 25,000 feet, not in spite of its twin engines, but because of them. Because each engine had a turbocharger that maintained power at altitude. Because American industry could build complex engines reliably and in quantity. Because American doctrine prioritized protecting bombers over conforming to European assumptions about fighter design. The twin engines should not have climbed, according to everything Luftwaffe pilots knew. But they did climb, and in doing so, they demonstrated that the war would be won not by who had the best doctrine in 1939, but by who could adapt fastest and produce more of what actually worked in 1943 and 1944. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.